They never raised their voice. They smiled. They listened. And somehow, they broke you. There's a certain kind of person who doesn't look dangerous, but leaves damage that words can't explain. You walk away from the conversation confused, hollow, even guilty, yet they never insulted you. That's the terrifying part. Carl Jung spent decades studying these subtle psychological threats, the kind that creep into your life cloaked in charm, virtue, and false warmth. What he discovered might be the most important warning of your life. The most dangerous people don't scream. They project. And if you don't recognize this one unconscious pattern, you'll keep inviting them into your world and thinking it's your fault. During his decades of clinical work, he uncovered a silent signal, a deeply disturbing indicator of psychological danger that most people overlook. It's not something you'll recognize through harsh words or openly toxic behavior. It's more subtle than that, and precisely because of its subtlety, it's far more dangerous. Jung called it shadow projection, a psychological mechanism so insidious it can turn the most charming person into a silent threat. It's one of the key dynamics people explore in shadow work today. You've probably experienced it before. Imagine this. You're having a conversation with someone. Out of nowhere, they accuse you of motives. You've never had emotions, you haven't felt intentions you never expressed. You stand there confused, thinking, where is this coming from? This is the exact kind of emotional distortion that shadow work aims to bring into conscious awareness. They're not responding to you. They're responding to a distorted version of you, a character they've unconsciously invented in their mind. This is shadow projection in its purest form. The shadow, according to Jung, is everything we reject about ourselves. The traits we've been taught to hide, the anger we suppress, the envy we deny, the fears we won't admit, even to ourselves. We bury these aspects deep in the unconscious thinking we've silenced them. But we haven't. They wait. They grow. And eventually, when someone refuses to look within those denied parts, explode outward, painted onto the people around them. That's when you become the enemy in someone else's internal war. The most terrifying part. They genuinely believe it. They're not lying. They truly see you as the problem, because they've lost the ability to recognize what lives in them. Ancient wisdom knew this long before psychology gave it a name. In Buddhism, it's the darkened mirror reflecting one's own impurities as if they belong to someone else. In Christianity, it's the beam in your own eye while you obsess over the speck in another's. We've always known, but Jung made it scientific, and he gave us a path to healing through what we now call shadow work. These people can be charismatic, persuasive, sometimes even revered. But behind the charm lies a distortion so powerful it reshapes reality itself. Neuroscience now confirms it. Our brains filter reality to confirm what we already believe. But in the case of massive shadow projection, that filter becomes a full-blown hallucination. You'll notice it when their words don't match your inner truth, when they label your kindness as manipulation, when they twist your silence into guilt, when they accuse you of energies you don't carry, and they do it with unwavering conviction. This is not about you. It's never been. You're simply the mirror they cannot bear to face. Jung warned that these people are often the ones who believe they are unquestionably good, morally superior, spiritually infallible, divinely right. He called this psychic inflation an ego so puffed up it becomes a false god in its own mind. The danger, it hides behind the illusion of virtue. Beware of those who preach light but cast long shadows. The road to hell, as the saying goes, is paved with good intentions. Jung would say it's also paved by people who refuse to look at their own darkness. So what do you do when you feel that chill in your bones? You walk away, silently, immediately, not in anger, not in judgment, but in sacred self-respect. Because your peace is not a playground for someone else's projections, and your soul was never meant to carry the burden of someone else's unlived truth. Perhaps the most alarming sign of all is not the rage of the wounded, nor the cruelty of the corrupt. It is the unwavering certainty of the enlightened. Because unlike arrogance, which reveals itself with noise and bravado, Jungian psychic inflation is much quieter, far more insidious. It begins when the ego fuses with something bigger than itself, not a dream, not a calling, but an archetype. The savior, the prophet, the bearer of truth. And from that moment on, the person no longer sees themselves as a limited, fallible human being, but as a vessel of the absolute. Their words are not opinions, they are commandments. Their decisions are not choices, they are destiny. Their presence in their own eyes is not personal, it is sacred. The German mystic Meister Eckhart warned about this centuries ago, calling it the most dangerous illusion on the spiritual path. Zen masters refer to it as Zen sickness, when the ego disguises itself in robes of wisdom. And Sufi mystics call it the veil of light, even more deceptive than the veil of darkness, because it blinds through brilliance. And here lies the telltale sign. They never doubt themselves, not even once. While the greatest spiritual teachers in history, Jesus, Buddha, Lao Tzu, bowed humbly before the mysteries of life, they also embodied the humility necessary for true spiritual growth. Those suffering from psychic inflation exhibit an alarming sense of infallibility. They don't wrestle with inner questions. They don't sit with uncertainty. Because to them, there is no room for error, no gray, no nuance, only truth, their truth. And tragically, we are drawn to it. There is a charisma that comes from this level of certainty, a magnetic pull. Because in a world full of noise and confusion, someone who speaks with absolute confidence becomes a lighthouse, even if they're leading us straight into the rocks. Carl Jung witnessed this repeatedly in his work. Individuals consumed by archetypal inflation had the ability to gather followers, to spark movements, to sway entire communities. Their radiance wasn't false, it was fueled by unconscious fire, a fire that could not be questioned, only followed. Chilean psychologist Claudio Naranjo once said, "The ordinary ego says, 'I am important.' The spiritual ego says, 'I am a channel of divine good.' And that one subtle shift, it changes everything. It's how spiritual narcissism becomes unrecognizable because it speaks in the language of angels while feeding on unseen shadows. So how do you know when you're in the presence of this dangerous inflation? Watch what happens when they are challenged. A person inflated with archetypal ego doesn't simply disagree. They feel attacked. Disagreement isn't just a difference in thought. It's heresy. Resistance isn't personal, it's opposition to the divine. You'll hear it in the tone, you'll feel it in your gut. Suddenly, your questions aren't welcomed, they're condemned. Your doubts aren't explored, they're silenced. And Jung warned, this inflation doesn't just endanger others, it destroys the self. When the ego claims the throne of God, the psyche begins to fracture under the pressure. The higher the inflation, the more catastrophic the eventual collapse. Because no human being, no matter how gifted, enlightened, or well-intentioned, can carry the weight of the infinite. And yet, some try. And those who do often become masters of the perfect mask. Jung called it the persona, a term borrowed from Greek theater. It is the role we play in society, the image we present to the world. And when used consciously, it helps us navigate life with grace. But when we identify completely with that mask, When we become the role, we lose something vital. Our soul. Jung observed something deeply unsettling. Certain people become so flawlessly adapted to their social roles, so refined, so agreeable, so together, that every trace of human contradiction disappears. No tension, no inner conflict, no visible imperfection, just a seamless performance. And it is this perfection that should make us pause. Because perfection is never human. It is a costume, and sometimes a coffin. As poet Fernando Pessoa once wrote, "The danger is not in wearing the mask. It is in forgetting that it's a mask." In Zen Buddhism, there is a concept called the original face before birth, the face we had before society told us who to be. The Taoist sages warned against polishing the surface so much that the substance beneath it wears away. But in the modern world, we have learned to polish, to present, to perform, until eventually we no longer know what exists underneath, and that perhaps is the most devastating form of loss. To succeed in becoming who the world wants you to be, and forget who you truly are. When we interact with someone who has been overtaken by an archetype, we may feel it before we understand it. It's not always something they say. It's not even how they act. It's something in the atmosphere, their eyes too focused, their presence too rehearsed, their energy too charged with meaning. It's as if you're speaking not to a person, but to a force. That's because in a very real psychological sense, you are. When a human being becomes fully identified with an archetype, whether it's the martyr, the savior, the punisher, or the eternal child, they are no longer speaking from their authentic self. They've become a vessel, a channel, a mouthpiece for something older than them, deeper than them, and far more powerful than the individual ego was ever meant to handle. Carl Jung called this archetypal possession, and he considered it one of the most serious psychological conditions a person can experience, one that often goes unrecognized, precisely because it hides behind spiritual language, moral certainty, or social righteousness. You'll notice something deeply strange when you're in its presence, a kind of psychological rigidity. Their ideas don't evolve. Their expressions don't change. Their reactions are too consistent, too symbolic, almost mythic in nature. It's as if they've stepped out of time and entered into a sacred drama, where every moment is a reenactment of their role, every relationship a battlefield of meaning, and every disagreement a threat to the archetype they serve. You may hear the tone of the righteous hero always battling evil in some form, or the wounded victim perpetually misunderstood by a cruel world, or the infallible teacher dispensing truth with unshakable authority. But in each case, what's missing is the one thing that makes a human being truly trustworthy: inner flexibility, the capacity to be wrong, to change, to doubt, to learn, to laugh at oneself. The archetypally possessed person cannot do these things because they are no longer an integrated self. They have become an idea acting through a body. Robert Moore, a brilliant Jungian thinker, once said, "You are no longer dealing with a whole person. You are interacting with a splinter of the collective psyche." And that is a warning. Because when someone is no longer present as an individual, they are no longer accountable as an individual. The archetype takes over. And archetypes, while powerful, are not compassionate. They are not kind. They do not forgive. They are symbols. And symbols do not weep when others suffer. Modern neuroscience has begun to catch up to what ancient traditions have known for millennia. Brain imaging studies show that during intense mystical or archetypal experiences, the regions responsible for personal identity, the sense of I am, go quiet. Meanwhile, areas linked to transpersonal awareness and emotional amplification light up like wildfire. Now in a controlled, sacred ritual under the guidance of elders, mentors, or spiritual frameworks, this shift can be healing. Shamans knew how to dance on that edge, how to hold the fire without letting it consume them. But when it happens spontaneously, without awareness and without boundaries, the results can be devastating. The possessed individual becomes a walking myth with no grounding, a live wire of psychological voltage with no insulation. This is why traditional cultures developed such rigorous systems of initiation, not because they feared the sacred, but because they respected it and understood that spiritual growth requires structure, discipline, and reverence. They understood that proximity to the divine required preparation, humility, and most of all, accountability. But in our modern world, we've forgotten that wisdom. We elevate charisma without discernment. We confuse passion for integrity, and we mistake certainty for truth. So how do you protect yourself? You listen to the quiet signs. That gut feeling, that flicker of tension in your chest, that moment where someone's words don't match their energy, when their light feels too bright, too blinding, too hollow. You remember what Jung spent his life teaching: the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And where there is no shadow, there is no truth. So be cautious with those who seem to embody only light, who never doubt, never bend, never reflect. Because behind that radiant mask may lie a soul long forgotten, buried beneath the very image of divinity they claim to represent. What makes archetypal possession so particularly dangerous is not just the loss of self-awareness, it's the gain of something far more seductive: superhuman certainty. The possessed do not hesitate. They do not second-guess. They speak and act with an unwavering clarity that can hypnotize crowds and command loyalty not because of truth, but because of sheer conviction. Carl Jung observed this disturbing dynamic in history's most charismatic political and religious leaders, those whose certainty did not stem from wisdom, but from possession. They moved nations, sparked revolutions, led spiritual awakenings, and sometimes unspeakable atrocities. Because here is the hidden truth about archetypes. They are not purely light. They are polarized forces of the collective unconscious, containing within them both salvation and destruction, compassion and cruelty, healing and fanaticism. The Savior archetype, for example, holds the seed of divine mercy, but also of righteous violence. When someone identifies completely with that archetype, they will inevitably manifest both sides, often without realizing the contradiction. They'll weep for the world in one breath and condemn it the next. They'll rescue one soul while crucifying another, all in the name of love. Jung documented countless cases where people possessed by archetypes committed acts that stood in total opposition to their conscious values. Later, they would claim they didn't remember, or worse, they would rationalize it as necessary. This is not hypocrisy. It is a fracture in consciousness. Archetypal possession is in essence the temporary loss of reflective awareness, and with it, the loss of what makes us fully human. But there is something even more haunting. A pattern so subtle, so disturbingly familiar, that when you see it clearly in another, a shiver runs down your spine. Jung called it the compulsion to repeat. It's when a person unconsciously reenacts the same painful experience again and again, as if trapped in an invisible script they didn't write yet, cannot stop performing. New characters, new settings, same heartbreak, same betrayal, same collapse. This is not self-sabotage in the traditional sense. It is not masochism or drama-seeking. It is the psyche's desperate attempt to reintegrate what was once broken, to return to the scene of the wound again and again, hoping to finally find resolution. But what happens when that inner wound doesn't get healed? It turns outward and begins to recruit others into the drama. The people around them become actors in an unfinished story. You might be cast as the betrayer, the abandoner, the rescuer, the one who finally makes it right, or the one who breaks them all over again. The most chilling part: they don't even realize they're doing it. As psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas described, these inner wounds operate as unthought knowns, formative experiences so deep, so early, or so traumatic that they were never processed through thought. They live beneath language, but they shape everything. This is where ancient spiritual traditions offer profound insight. In early Buddhism, karma didn't mean divine punishment. It meant pattern. It meant repetition. The endless loop of conditions recreating themselves until awareness intervenes. In Christianity, the concept of original sin can be interpreted not as moral guilt, but as the inheritance of unconscious patterns passed from generation to generation like spiritual DNA driving our behaviors until we awaken. The clearest sign of this pattern: when someone keeps ending up in the same emotional tragedy, just with different names and faces. They tell the same story, just dressed in new clothes. And each time they are genuinely shocked, as if it were fate, as if life were punishing them, as if they were cursed. But the truth is harder to face. They are the unconscious architect of the very pattern they suffer under. Modern neuroscience now validates this ancient understanding. Early trauma creates neural pathways, literal grooves in the brain through which information travels most easily. These paths become mental shortcuts, emotional reflexes, expectations about how the world will treat us. And the brain, it prefers confirmation to truth. It seeks out people, situations, and dynamics that match its internal model, even when that model is soaked in suffering. But here is the real danger. People caught in the grip of the compulsion to repeat will unconsciously recruit you. They will invite you into their pattern, into a story that started long before you met them. And if you are unaware, you might accept the role. You might feel guilt you didn't earn. You might be punished for a wound you didn't inflict. You might be asked to save someone who doesn't actually want to be healed, only rewounded in the same familiar way. Jung noted something extraordinary. The more unconscious the pattern, the more it manifests as synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem like destiny. You meet someone in the most uncanny way. You feel inexplicably drawn to them. It all feels fated. But fate without consciousness is just repetition. It's not destiny, it's a loop. And until it's seen, it cannot be broken. The tragedy of unresolved trauma is not just that it wounds us, it repeats us. The person caught in the compulsion to repeat lives within a story they did not write, yet unconsciously retell. They recreate scenes of betrayal, abandonment, or humiliation, not out of desire, but because their psyche is still trying desperately to resolve what was once intolerable. The pain they could not process as children becomes the pattern they enact as adults. To them, these recurring experiences feel like bad luck, cruel fate, proof that the world is hostile or that love never lasts. But Jungian therapists know better. They begin to notice the patterns. The client who is always the betrayed one, the one who is always the misunderstood one, the one who is always the one who gives everything, only to be left with nothing. Marie-Louise von Franz Jung's most brilliant collaborator gave this chilling truth its most unforgettable phrasing. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And worse still, the psyche doesn't just attract any partner, friend, or situation. It seeks out with uncanny precision the exact people who will help it recreate the original wound. Jung called this negative synchronicity a dark gravity of the soul, an invisible choreography of pain, where our unconscious needs summon the very people who will hurt us, just like before. But here's the great secret, the lifeline buried beneath the shadow. There is a way out. There is a path, ancient, difficult, sacred, toward transformation. And it begins not with perfection, but with integration. This is the line that separates the spiritually dangerous from the spiritually awakened. It is not goodness. It is not purity. It is spiritual growth through wholeness. Because the real danger isn't darkness. It's disowning the darkness, pretending it's not there, forcing it underground, letting it fester in secret. Jung called this process shadow integration, and it may be the most courageous act a person can undertake. It's the very heart of shadow work, not to reject what's dark, but to transform it. Not to deny their anger, envy, pride, or despair, but to face it, to hold it, to say, yes, this too is mine. I would rather be whole than good. Jung once wrote a phrase often misunderstood. He wasn't glorifying moral failure. He was warning us the mask of goodness is often more dangerous than honest darkness. Because behind that mask, division festers. And what festers eventually erupts. Contemplative traditions across time understood this. Tibetan Buddhism teaches the alchemy of turning poison into medicine, embracing painful emotions as sacred materials for awakening. Western alchemy, which so deeply fascinated Jung, saw the soul's journey as the transformation of lead into gold, lead being the rejected heavy aspects of the self, and gold being integrated conscious presence. And when someone genuinely begins this inner alchemy, you can feel it. They carry a strange and beautiful quality, a calm honesty. They admit their flaws without shame or pride. This quiet honesty is the essence of spiritual growth. They hold compassion for others not because they are above them, but because they see themselves in every wound, every mistake, every shadow. This is the person who does not flinch at your pain. They do not judge your darkness, because they've met their own and made peace with it. Contemporary neuroscience now affirms what mystics and Jungians have always known. Integration changes the brain. Researchers like Daniel Siegel have found that when people begin to consciously process and accept their previously dissociated experiences, new neural pathways begin to form. The limbic system, home of emotion and trauma, starts connecting with the prefrontal cortex, the seat of awareness and self-reflection. What does this mean? It means the act of facing our shadow rewires the very structure of our consciousness. As Jungian analyst Robert Johnson once said, "What we deny does not disappear. It only emerges in forms we can no longer control. But what we accept, what we bring into the light, loses its power to sabotage and gains the power to create." The person who has walked through the fire of self-confrontation without turning away becomes a force of psychological clarity. They no longer divide the world into saints and sinners. They no longer cling to the illusion of their own innocence. They understand what James Hollis called the beginning of psychological maturity. When we give up the fantasy of our own blamelessness, these are the people we instinctively trust, not because they are perfect, but because they are real. And in their presence, we are reminded that we too can be whole. Even the most awakened among us have shadows. The Dalai Lama has spoken openly about his moments of anger. Teresa of Avila wrote honestly of her seasons of spiritual dryness and despair. And the Sufi mystic Rumi turned his inner contradictions into poetry that still moves hearts centuries later. This kind of radical honesty, soft, courageous disarming, stands in stark contrast to the cold perfection of those who live dissociated from their inner darkness. Because true light does not deny the dark. It embraces it with compassion. If you wish to recognize someone who is walking the path of integration, look not for perfection, but for a quiet presence, a rare blend of humility without self-erasure and authority without domination. They do not advertise their goodness. They do not need to. Their peace speaks louder than their words. Their eyes carry the weight of battles fought within, and they no longer chase the illusion of being spotless. They are whole, and that is enough. As Zen master Shunryu Suzuki once said, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities. In the expert's there are few." So before we say goodbye, let me ask you gently, have you seen any of these signs in the people you love, in your relationships, or perhaps in yourself? If something in this message stirred your soul, let it echo. Write to us in the comments. Speak your truth. Because awareness, simple, quiet. Trembling awareness is the first step toward transformation and spiritual growth. And if you believe this insight might awaken someone else, share it. Because sometimes the right words at the right time can interrupt a lifetime of unconscious patterns. Subscribe to this channel for deeper journeys into the sacred depths of the human psyche. Tap the bell so you never miss a moment of reflection. And remember, you are not here to be perfect. You are here to become whole.